By next spring, that old man will be begging us to haul it away." The logging crew laughed as 14 trucks buried 18 acres of Walter Collins's farm beneath broken branches, bark, and roots. 4 years later, nobody was laughing. The same foreman stood in Walter's driveway holding a checkbook, asking if he had room for another 100 truckloads. To understand why, you have to go back to October of 2011. In October of 2011, 14 logging trucks came rumbling down the narrow dirt road that led to Walter Collins's farm in Douglas County, Oregon. Each truck was loaded with broken branches, bark, roots, wood chips, and twisted pieces of timber the sawmill did not want. When the first truck raised its bed, several tons of debris crashed onto the north field. Branches snapped beneath the weight. Dust rose into the cold morning air. By sunset, nearly 18 acres of Walter's land had been covered. One of the younger loggers climbed down from his truck, kicked a broken piece of fir, and laughed. "This junk isn't even worth burning." The men around him laughed too. Rick Dalton, the logging foreman, looked across the growing piles and shook his head. "By next spring, that old man will be begging us to haul it away." Walter Collins heard every word. He was 64 years old, broad-shouldered but lean, with gray hair beneath a grease-darkened cap. He wore a faded canvas jacket, work boots stained with mud, and leather gloves worn smooth by 40 years of farm work. Beside him stood an old Ford 3000 tractor that had belonged to him and his late wife, Evelyn. Walter did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He looked directly at Rick and said, "Don't move a single branch." The laughter stopped. Rick studied him. "Mr. Collins, once we dump this here, we are not coming back to clean it up." Walter nodded. "I understand. You're sure?" "Every piece stays." Rick shrugged and waved the next truck forward. What he did not know was that 4 years later, those same men would return to that field, not to remove the debris, but to ask Walter how much he would charge them to bring more. Walter's farm was not large or impressive. He owned 80 acres, 7 aging cows, 2 weathered hay barns, and 1 old tractor. His wife, Evelyn, had died 3 years earlier, after nearly 40 years of farming beside him. Together, they had raised cattle, cut hay, repaired fences, and paid off the final farm loan in 1998. Evelyn used to say that a farm did not need to impress anyone. It only needed to feed the family and stay in the family. Walter had kept that promise. He lived simply. He owned no new machinery. He hired no workers. And he owed nothing to the bank. The north field had always been the worst part of the property. The topsoil was thin. The ground was full of rock. During the winter rains, water rushed downhill and carried loose soil with it. By July, the field became so dry and hard that a shovel could barely break the surface. Walter and Evelyn had planted grass there 3 times. Every planting failed after 1 or 2 hot summers. The neighbors called it the dead field. Across the road lived Hank Morris. Hank owned nearly 400 acres, 2 new tractors, a large round baler, and some of the best pasture in the valley. He was not a cruel man, but he had a loud voice, expensive equipment, and very little patience for ideas he did not understand. And he did not understand Walter Collins. The whole thing began when Rick Dalton's logging company started clearing timber about 5 miles away. The company had thousands of tons of branches, bark, roots, and damaged wood that could not be sold. Hauling everything to a commercial disposal site would cost time, fuel, and money. So Rick came to Walter with an offer. The company would pay him $3,000, repair the dirt road leading to his barns, and place the debris only on the unused north field. $3,000, a repaired road, and nothing else required from him. To most people it sounded like easy money. But Walter did not sign immediately. He listened. Then he asked 3 questions. Is most of the wood fir and alder? Rick nodded. Any chemically treated lumber, fuel, or machine oil mixed in? No. Can you keep the large logs separate from the smaller material? Rick looked surprised. I suppose we can. Then he smiled. But it's still waste. Walter picked up the pen and signed the agreement. The land is never in a hurry, he said. Rick did not understand what he meant. Neither did Walter's neighbors. But Walter did. News spread quickly through the small Oregon town. At the feed store, men said Walter Collins was turning his farm into a dump. At the diner, Hank Morris told anyone willing to listen that he had signed the worst agreement in county history. When the trucks began arriving, Hank parked his pickup beside Walter's fence and watched one load of branches fall onto the field. You'll spend twice that $3,000 getting rid of this mess, he called. Walter stood near the tractor. Maybe. Hank laughed. Not maybe. Definitely. Walter looked toward the mountains. The land is never in a hurry. Hank shook his head. The land may not be in a hurry, but bills are. Walter said nothing more. For 3 weeks, the trucks kept coming. By the time the final load arrived, the north field looked as if a storm had torn through an entire forest. Rick handed Walter the check. You still have time to let us push everything into one pile, he said. It'll be easier to remove later. No. What are you planning to do with all of it? Nothing yet. Rick looked across the branches. That's your plan. For now. All winter, the debris stayed where it was. Rain soaked into the bark. Leaves collected beneath the branches. Water that had once rushed across the bare field began to slow. In spring, Walter used the old Ford tractor to drag the largest pieces into low rows, running across the slope. He did not bury them. He did not pile them against buildings. He left open paths between the rows, kept the debris away from fences, and spread the smaller bark pieces over the most exposed soil. His son, Daniel, came to visit one afternoon. He walked into the field, picked up a piece of bark, and frowned. How long are you going to leave this here? A few years. This stuff takes forever to break down. I know. So what are you waiting for? Walter looked toward the tree line. The soil is eating. Daniel laughed. Walter did not. When will it be finished? Daniel asked. Walter gave him the same answer he had given Rick. The land is never in a hurry. Long before Walter became a farmer, he had spent one season working on a Forest Service restoration crew. He had learned something most people around him had forgotten. Healthy forests rarely had bare ground. Fallen branches slowed rainwater. Dead roots created channels in the soil. Bark protected the surface from direct sun. Rotting wood held moisture and fed fungi, insects, and microorganisms. A forest did not see fallen timber as waste. Evelyn had understood that too. Whenever neighbors cleared every branch and dead limb from their land, she would say, "A forest never cleans up after itself." Walter did not expect a miracle. He knew fresh wood could temporarily tie up nutrients near the surface. He knew heavy piles could increase fire risk. He knew contaminated material could damage the soil. That was why he had asked Rick to sort it. That was why he had left open spaces between the rows. And that was why he was willing to wait. His goal was not to make the field fertile overnight. He only wanted to slow the water, shade the soil, and give living things a chance to return. The first year, almost nothing seemed to happen. The field still looked ugly. Weeds grew between the branches. Some piles settled into the mud. Others looked exactly as they had on the day they were dumped. Hank drove past and shook his head whenever he saw Walter working there. One afternoon, he stopped while Walter was spreading bark around a bare patch. "You know that won't become good soil in 1 year," Hank said. "I know. Maybe not in 10. Maybe. Then why keep doing it?" Walter leaned against his rake. "Because the soil doesn't care whether we are patient." Hank drove away unconvinced. A few weeks later, Walter found the first sign. He lifted a section of wet alder bark and noticed movement underneath. Earthworms. Dozens of them. The north field had been too dry and compacted to hold many worms for years. Walter knelt in the mud and watched them disappear into the darker soil. He remembered something Evelyn had once told him. When the worms come back, the land is breathing again. Walter smiled. He placed the bark back exactly where he had found it. He told no one. The second sign came during a winter storm. Nearly 3 inches of rain fell in less than 2 days. Water rushed across Hank's upper pasture, cutting shallow channels through the exposed ground. Mud poured through the drainage ditch and spread across part of the county road. On Walter's north field, the rows of branches caught leaves, slowed the water, and allowed more of it to soak into the ground. There was still runoff. There was still erosion, but far less than before. Rick happened to drive past while checking a timber road. He pulled his pickup to the shoulder and watched the water move through Walter's field. Instead of racing downhill, it curled around the debris and collected behind the rows. Walter was standing in the rain with a shovel, opening a small channel where water had pooled too deeply. Rick climbed out of his truck. "You planned this?" Walter kept working. "I hoped for it." Rick looked toward Hank's muddy drainage ditch, then back at Walter's field. "You really think this is working?" Walter pressed the shovel into the soil. "The soil isn't finished yet." Rick stood there for another minute. He did not laugh. By the second summer, mushrooms appeared on several alder logs. Native grass began returning between the rows. The soil beneath the bark stayed cooler than the exposed ground nearby. In the third year, Walter planted clover and drought-resistant orchard grass in the softer areas. Some of it failed. Some seeds never germinated. Some plants died during the first hot week. For the first time, Walter wondered whether Hank had been right. One evening, he stood alone near the kitchen window and looked toward the north field. Evelyn's photograph rested on the shelf beside him. Walter spoke quietly. "I hope I didn't make the biggest mistake of my life." The next morning, he went back to work. The land was not finished yet. That summer, a second planting failed on the driest part of the field. Walter had to buy more seed. He repaired the tractor's hydraulic line with money he had planned to use for the barn roof. Daniel suggested clearing part of the debris and starting over. Walter almost agreed. Then he lifted another piece of bark and found cool soil underneath. So he stayed with the plan. Enough grass survived to begin changing the appearance of the field. The dead field was no longer entirely dead. Still, it had not yet proven Walter right. That happened in the summer of 2015. The rain stopped early. By the end of May, rainfall was well below normal. June was hot. July was worse. The wind turned dry and sharp. Pastures across the county faded from green to yellow. Small ponds shrank. The soil on Hank's farm cracked under the heat. Hay prices climbed every week. Farmers who had planned to cut a second crop began buying feed instead. Walter's south pasture dried out too. He was not protected from the drought. By late July, he had to sell 2 of his 7 cows because he could no longer justify the feed cost. He watched the trailer carry them away without saying a word. That night, he sat alone at the kitchen table. The money from the sale lay in an envelope beside Evelyn's photograph. The north field had helped, but not enough to save everything. For the first time, Walter looked tired rather than patient. The next morning, he walked back to the field. The exposed areas were dry and hard. Yet beneath the bark and fallen branches, the ground remained cooler. Moisture from the winter rains had lasted longer. The clover stayed low, but alive. The orchard grass did not grow tall, but its roots survived. The field was not a green paradise. It was something more believable and more valuable. It was still functioning. Walter moved his remaining 5 cows into the north field for a few hours each morning. The available grass could not feed them completely, but it reduced the hay they needed. That difference allowed him to keep the rest of the herd. One afternoon, Hank stood beside the fence and watched the cows grazing between the old branches. He no longer smiled. "How much water did you put on this field?" "None." That can't be right. Walter took a small shovel and removed a layer of bark. The soil beneath it was not wet, but it was soft, dark, and cool. He placed a handful in Hank's palm. Hank rubbed it between his fingers. Then he looked across the road at his own yellow pasture. You knew this would happen. Walter shook his head. I hoped it would. What's the difference? Knowing is when you want to prove you're right. Walter replaced the bark. Hoping is when you do the work and let time answer. Hank stared at the ground for a long moment. The next morning, he returned with 2 rolls of fencing wire in his truck. I had these left over, he said. Thought you might need them. It was not an apology, but Walter understood what it meant. He accepted the wire and thanked him. By the end of summer, people had stopped calling it the dead field. Farmers slowed down when they passed Walter's gate. Some asked how he arranged the branches. Others wanted to know how thick the bark should be. Walter warned them not to copy him blindly. The material had to be clean. The piles had to be managed for fire safety. Heavy wood should not be placed where machinery needed to operate. The method took years, and it would not work the same way on every piece of land. Walter never claimed to be an expert. He simply showed people what had happened. That honesty made them listen. In October, a silver pickup turned into Walter's driveway. Rick Dalton stepped out. 2 other men from the logging company were with him. Rick walked slowly across the north field. He lifted a piece of alder that had begun to soften. Underneath it, the soil was dark. Several earthworms disappeared into the ground as sunlight reached them. Rick crouched and picked up a handful of soil. For several seconds, he said nothing. There was no music from a radio, no engine running nearby, only the sound of wind moving through the grass. Walter stood behind him and waited. Finally, Rick spoke. 4 years ago, I thought we were saving money by dumping our waste here. He let the soil fall slowly through his fingers. Turns out we were throwing away something useful. Walter looked across the field. Rick continued. Our company is starting another logging project 12 miles from here. We'll have bark, branches, and damaged wood again. There isn't much room left here. We can sort it before delivery. We can chip the smaller material. And some neighboring farms want to use it for erosion control. Walter studied him. You want to dump it for free again? Rick shook his head. No. He walked back to the truck and returned with a folder. This time, we'll pay you to help us handle it properly. Walter opened the folder, but did not read it immediately. Rick looked at the field once more. How much would you charge us to take another 100 truckloads? Walter closed the folder. Only if you promise me one thing. What? Stop calling it waste. Rick smiled. Deal. Walter nodded toward the field. I told you. The land is never in a hurry. Walter never became rich. He never appeared on television. But the agreement paid enough to repair the barn roof, replace the tires on the old Ford, and keep the farm debt-free. The logging company began sorting more of its debris instead of treating everything as worthless. Several farms used the clean material to slow erosion on land that was not regularly cultivated, and the north field continued to improve. Slowly, unevenly, without miracles. Years later, Walter stood there with his granddaughter. The girl pointed at an old log that had nearly rotted into the ground. Grandpa, why didn't you get angry when they covered your field with all that junk? Walter bent down and placed a handful of dark soil into the child's palm. Because I wasn't looking at what it was. What were you looking at? Walter closed the girl's fingers around the soil. What it could become. People later said Walter Collins had turned waste into good land. But that was not exactly true. He had not transformed it with a secret formula. He had simply remembered something others had forgotten. A broken branch can slow water. A rotting log can shelter a seedling. A layer of bark can protect moisture through the hottest days of summer. And sometimes, what the world is desperate to throw away only needs the right place, enough time, and someone patient enough to recognize its value. They covered Walter Collins's field with logging debris. He never complained, because the land was never in a hurry, and neither was he.